This video is to provide a brief tutorial on completing the critical assignment or capstone paper for BEH 333. So we've been through a long journey going through the worldview categories of cosmology and worldview, psychological and theological anthropology, looking at the different perspectives on human nature. What does the Bible say? What does Christianity say about human nature? Remember, the core category there was image of God. And we talked about function, structure, and relation. And then on the psychological and behavioral sciences side, there are definitely also perspectives on human nature. What comprises human nature? Do humans have ids, egos, and superegos, for example? What does it mean to have a cognitive science perspective on human nature? Are humans only their cognitions or their brains? Are we more than that? And what would that more be? What is the will and how does it function? How do humans make decisions? All of those are components to the idea of human nature. Next, we talked about this idea of what's wrong. And so, of course, from the behavioral science side, there's, of course, an entire field of psychology, abnormal psychology, devoted to understanding where do people get derailed? How do they experience problems that way? And what does that look like? And then, of course, on the sociological side or the sociology side, there are lots of social problems, and how do societies support them? How do social structures actually create and cause those social problems? And then what do we do about it? How do we fix them? And so all of these perspectives are related to the nature of problems, what's wrong. And then, of course, Christianity would talk about sin as being the core answer to that. And, of course, there's the sins that we do to other people, and then there are the sins that are done to us, and then there's just the idea of sin as a state, or an ontological category, a component of our being, and what that means for us. And then finally, we are talking about how to fix those problems. Of course, again, psychologically speaking, therapy and therapeutics are the core components therein. People have mental problems, psychological problems. You go to see a psychologist, a marriage and family therapist, a licensed professional counselor, and then they apply some sort of technique, and that technique is supposed to ameliorate your problem. On the social side or the society side, the implementation of certain policies, addressing unjust social structures, understanding kind of certain biases or tendencies within certain cultures or social groups or classes or niches in the society. All of those perspectives are designed to illuminate and address social problems. Now, we pro-offer the categories of telos, meaning goal or ultimate outcome; tactics, meaning the specific things or interventions or steps taken to address those problems; and then, of course, target. Where are the interventions designed to maximize or have maximum effect? So, generally speaking, for psychology, the thoughts, or cognitive therapy is targeting the thoughts. Object relations therapy tends to impact the emotions or the feelings, the subjective experience of the individual. And then, of course, relationality is focused with family therapy perspectives, improving interpersonal relationships, those kinds of things. And then, of course, on the sociology side, those tactics and target apply. Of course, what's the goal? What's a utopian or just society? What are the tactics? How do we initiate social change? Of course, and then the target, of course, would even be broader than relationships. It would be at the societal level. What do we need to do, sociologically speaking, to have this ideal society that we're trying to achieve? So those are the main kind of where we've been summary in a 5-minute overview of where we've been. And I just want to congratulate you all. This class is very challenging, going for 8 weeks and focusing on so much philosophical and theoretical concepts and constructs, and how well you've all done to this point. And so the final hurdle is this critical assignment. Now, as we've been talking about, each of the preceding assignments have led up to this final critical assignment. And so I want you to combine the components in your reflections on cosmology, anthropology, sin and salvation, atonement, developed from the earlier weeks, into your personal theory of integration. Now, as you are developing your own theory of integration, I want you to remember and pick up the reflections that you've had on these previous other worldview perspectives. Now, you've spent the last 7 weeks in this course reflecting on the major components: cosmology, anthropology, sin, and atonement, and as well as there be the social science corresponding categories. However, so my intent for this paper isn't necessarily that you copy and paste, although I'm hoping that you can take significant portions of what you've already done to be included in your paper and tweak it or massage it or drive it toward the specifics of this assignment. So particularly, I want you to select a specific topic in psychology, something like mental illness, divorce, alcohol dependence, sexual orientation, domestic violence, or, depending on your major, right, psychology or sociology, specific social problems, homelessness, poverty, things like that, racism, and view it through an integrative lens, specifically the lens that we've been developing: cosmology, anthropology, sin, and atonement. Rely on your personal theory regarding the worldview issues developed earlier in the course in terms of discussing how your worldview relates to this behavioral science issue. So, for example, if we take a specific topic like depression, and be as specific as possible about your topics. Don't be generally speaking about mental illness. That's too broad for a 6-page paper. Be very specific. And I want you to explore how depression in this example is related to human nature. Being depressed or having depression, what does that say about human nature? What does it say about our brains, our behavior, our thoughts, our feelings? What does it say about sin in this process? Right? That is, did I do something wrong? Is depression caused, right? Is it caused by God? And how is that related to what we know about the psychological causes of depression? And then, of course, how do we fix it? What does that say? Now, the cosmological piece for the behavioral sciences perspective is mainly related to epistemology, right? So, of course, in the behavioral sciences, science, right, is the main epistemological approach. And how does that relate to how we know things in terms of our philosophy or our theology or our Christian perspective? So what I want you to do is to better understand how your worldview shapes understanding the chosen topic. So if depression, going back to the depression example, please explain what it means to be human and psychologically functioning in a healthy manner, what our purpose is in the world to function in a psychologically healthy manner, what happens, what goes wrong leading to depression, and then what we can do about that, how we can fix depression, and based in your theory as part of this course. And so, right, so as we are thinking about this, we would have the psychological understanding. Humans are rational beings, maybe. What does the Bible say about that? When it comes to the nature of problems, psychology identifies depression as a huge problem. Depression, from a Christian perspective, looks like this. Whatever this is, psychology says that depression is caused by X, Y, and Z. How does that relate to what a Christian understanding of what causes problems are? Now, there's going to be a lot of comparing overlap and also differences, compare and contrast, right? So, to structure your paper, this is what I want you to do. There'll be a literature review section having 5 academic sources and from a theological viewpoint. Your textbooks count as academic resources for this paper, and 5 sources from a psychological or scientific perspective. And so you will have a literature review looking at the psychological perspectives on depression. What do we understand about human nature? How do we understand the causes of depression? And how do we go about fixing that? Right. So that's the literature review. And in that literature review, you will compare and contrast the Christian perspective. Right. So the literature review is the heading wherein you talk about the 4 worldview perspectives from both a psychological and a Christian perspective. And then there'll be a final component where you synthesize these findings, culminating in your personal theory of integration. Right? So you'll have 2 headings, literature review, personal theory of integration, wherein you will have subparts of the Christian perspective on worldview, human nature or anthropology, sin and salvation or atonement. And then you'll have corresponding components about psychology, worldview. Remember, that's mainly focused on the epistemological component. You will also have a component on personality and human nature, abnormal psychology, what causes depression, and then what do we know about the literature related to treating depression. All of those things will lead to your personal theory of integration. So you could end up saying something like, using depression as an example, my theory of integration would talk about how that there are some overlapping components of human nature from a Christian perspective and a psychological perspective. These are, and then you would identify them for you. Further, when we think about a mental illness like depression, what we understand is that psychology says depression is caused by X, Y, and Z. That corresponds well with my Christian perspective on sin. However, there are also differences there, and then you would enumerate them. And then finally, you would do the same thing with psychotherapy of depression and salvation and atonement. So what difference does Jesus make for a depressed person? I would assume, and I theorize that Jesus makes a difference for the depressed person, differently than Jesus makes a difference for an anxiety person, or a person suffering from schizophrenia, or a person that's going through severe relationship conflict. So that Jesus would look different in those positions that way. So just keep that in mind. Paper should be 6 pages, 1-inch margins, double spaced. These are all APA perspectives. You also include a title and reference page, and the in-text citations should be in APA format. If you need assistance with APA format, please review the APA sample paper. An abstract is not needed for this paper. Very important. Please do not include an abstract. So you will have the title page, have an introduction, briefly outlining what you want to accomplish in the paper and introduce your topic. It's a paragraph. Maybe 5 sentences. Have a worldview issue section where you'll explore the types of worldview perspectives and how these relate to your topic briefly, and then a literature review section, which is the main body of your paper, where you'll talk about how you will have the different perspectives we outlined above in terms of psychological perspective, Christian perspective on depression. And then you will have a discussion section where you will develop your personal theory based on your coursework and the behavioral research that you've done. And finally, an APA formatted reference page. Now remember, this is the critical assignment for this course, and it needs to be passed at the 70%. Right? And remember, you need to submit your original paper to the originality report from SafeAssign along with the critical assignment. So please review the criteria here for your paper. what you need to do. Now remember, right, title page is not a heading. I don't need an introductory heading. I do need a literature review heading. And under that literature review heading is where you're going to mainly address the specific components that we talked about, the behavioral science perspective, the psychology perspective, and how they relate to the worldview dimensions. Right? So I do need a specific header pointing me toward the literature review, and then underneath that, if you want to use subheadings, you are welcome to. Just clearly identify the 4 categories: cosmology, anthropology, sin, and atonement, as we've been talking about. And then if you want to put a discussion section heading, or you could even title that personal theory of integration section, that would be fine as well. And then of course the reference page needs a specific APA formatted header in the paper, but you should know that already. So once you've written your paper, you will need to come down here and you will need to submit it for the originality report from SafeAssign. So that's a very important step for you to take. I need you to have that done. Number one, it helps us to be clear about the concern for plagiarism, that kind of thing. So you'll click there. And finally, I want to show you, now I know we haven't done a lot of online research. We did a little bit, but not very much of research. Now, most students that I know go to Google and they type in what they're searching for. I don't want you to do that. What I want you to do is, I'm hoping that this website is very, very, very familiar to you. And you should bookmark it if you haven't. So this is our CBU Online homepage. You will go to current students. You will go down to, this is probably the easiest way to sign into Blackboard, but you should go down to library to do your research. Now this is the library webpage. I'm hoping this is very familiar to you all as well. Now I know there's a one search function where you can type in whatever you want to type in to search. My recommendation is to not do that, to go to databases, go down to psych info. This will come up. You will need to sign in. So you sign in using your CBU email credentials, right? Your email and your password for your email. Now you can come in here and then type in your search words. Depression. Okay, so we'll push search, and you will get a 300,000 hits right now. So what I want you to do is not just take the top 4, go ahead and look at them. Okay, does the title of the article seem to fit your paper? I don't know. Then you have to decide that, what you're trying to talk about. Read through the abstract. Does that sound like a paper that could help you with your paper? If it is, then you can click here on linked full text. It'll take you right to the paper. And then click this link to open in a new window. So here we go. There it is. So you can download it. Now this is free because you've already paid, as part of your tuition, the use of the library. Right? So if you use Google to find your resources, sometimes you have to pay for them. So don't do that. You have already paid for them. Finally, some of these might not be a PDF or a full text. Excuse me. If you have to interlibrary loan them, don't get them. And remember, you don't need a ton of article, right? You need 5 on the psych or sociology side, and you need 4 or 5 academic references on the Christian piece. You feel free to use your course textbooks. Those are all primary sources that you may cite. The Bible does not count as a reference. It's a classic work. In an APA format, you do not need to cite the Bible. So just remember that. Now, in the text you do, Mark 1:1, but you don't need to tell me, Holy Bible, Zondervan, blah, 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 whatever. So in the reference page. So that concludes our tutorial and approach to understanding how to do a literature review.